Welcome to the Fred W. Smith National Library for the study of George Washington, first American president, commander of the Continental Army, and president of the Constitutional Convention. Learn more about the many varied roles that Washington excelled in, and the tremendous legacy he left for America and the world. George Washington, heralded as the father of our country, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Those are the words of Colonel Henry Lee. You may be wondering how a young, uneducated Virginian rose to such an elevated status. I certainly have. Much has been written about Washington, and much of it untrue. For example, he had wooden teeth, or the chopping down of the proverbial cherry tree, or I cannot tell a lie. Oh, believe me, the truth is far more fascinating. As I wrote to Dr. Benjamin Rush, the history of our revolution will be one continued lie from one end to the other. The essence of the whole will be that Dr. Franklin's electrical rod smote the earth and out sprung General Washington. That Franklin's rod electrified him, and thenceforward these two conducted all the policy, negotiations, legislatures, and war. But that was long ago, and in a moment of supreme agitation on my part, think about it. Consider many of the founders. Benjamin Franklin was probably wiser than George Washington, although that is arguable. Alexander Hamilton was more brilliant than Washington. James Madison was more politically shrewd. Thomas Jefferson was undeniably more intellectually sophisticated. And I am unquestionably more engaging. But all of us would agree he was our superior. Whenever we gathered, we chose him to lead us because he was always the tallest man in the room. Oh, he was a majestic sight to behold, a handsome face, a tall stature, graceful attitudes and movements, a large, imposing fortune. And Washington was a Virginian. Oh, this is equivalent to 5 talents. Oh, Virginian geese are all swans. But what was it that set him apart from all others? The answer is here, waiting for discovery among the letters and correspondence of our time. If you could travel back in time, back to the year 1783, you could witness George Washington as he defeated the last military threat to the Republic, a treasonous plot by officers of his own Continental Army. The plot grew out of anxiety, anger, and boredom. For by 1782, it appeared that Tom Paine had been wrong. The season of discontent was not that barren winter at Valley Forge. It was the long months of waiting that followed the American victory at Yorktown. Technically, the war was over. The men had little to occupy their thoughts, except for their grievances against the government. They were owed years of back pay by 1782. Sadly, the Articles of Confederation gave Congress the privilege of asking for everything, but gave the states the prerogative of granting nothing. Oh, the coffers were utterly empty. They feared they would never see back pay owed them, nor the pensions promised for staying the course of the war. Washington understood. As he wrote in a letter to General Benjamin Lincoln, "My men have suffered everything human nature is capable of enduring, this side of death." Now, here's where the plot thickens. There were men in government whose anxiety about the Confederation equaled that of the military. They considered it a danger to the new republic. As men who thought continentally, they preferred a government with genuine power, including the power to tax. By 1782, these nationalists like Robert Morris, Gouverneur Morris, and Alexander Hamilton were in the minority as they pushed for an import tax that would bring desperately needed revenue into the national treasury. Some, like Hamilton, began to wonder if this Republican experiment was going to work. Maybe we needed a king. After all, he was the face of the American Revolution. That November, their luck seemed to turn, for the arrival of a delegation of senior military officers determined to meet with Congress suggested a new strategy, one that was simple and dangerous. Fan the fires of discontent among the Army officers. With the threat of military insurrection, Congress would be forced to approve the impost in order to make good on the promise of bonuses and pensions. These nationalists were playing with fire, and they found men who were willing to get burned. General Horatio Gates, the immediate commander of the New Windsor camp, was notoriously jealous of Washington. His protege, John Armstrong, authored an anonymous letter and circulated it throughout the camp. It urged them to send a final petition to Congress, one that was threatening. If peace came, the military would use force to win its due. If war came, the military would lay down its arms and refuse to protect the Republic. The conspirators called a meeting of the officers on March 11th. Washington issued general orders that same day that denied their right to convene, taking control of the tempo of events. He issued his own call to a meeting on March 15th. At that meeting, he expected the men to discuss a course of action and provide a written statement of their intentions. He left the impression that he would not be present and that General Gates would preside. I think George may have lied. Whew, imagine that. At the appointed time, the officers began to fill the Temple of Virtue, the chapel and meeting hall at Newburgh, New York. A confident General Gates opened the meeting when a small door off the temple stage opened, and in walked General Washington. He did not mince words. The author of the letter was unknown, but his intentions were clear. This was a man without rectitude, without regard to justice or love of country, a man with the blackest designs. But the man who stands before you today has never left your side one moment. You will, by the dignity of your conduct, allow posterity to say, had this day been wanting, the world had never seen the last stage of perfection to which human nature is capable of attaining. Was his eloquent call to duty, honor, and devotion to country enough? He was unsure, so he drew from his pocket a letter from Joseph Jones, a member of Congress, to express the goodwill of the government. He stumbled over the words as he reached into another pocket for his new glasses. There was a collective gasp from the assembled officers as he said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have grown gray and almost blind in the service of my country." The impact of this simple statement was profound. When he spoke, every doubt was dispelled, and the tide of patriotism rolled again in its wonted course. It was over. On March 18th, Washington forwarded their resolutions to Congress. They demonstrated, he said, the last glorious proof of patriotism from the Continental Army. In 1784, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "The moderation and virtue of a single character has probably prevented this revolution from being closed, as most others have been, by a subversion of that liberty it was intended to establish." It was later that year, 1783, that Washington made his most moral mark, and the results were monumental. The greatest act of his life, the one that made him famous, was his resignation as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. This act is what he called his greatest legacy to his country, and no American leader has left a more important legacy. He stunned the world when he surrendered his sword to Congress on December 23rd, 1783. At that moment, he was transformed from the nation's military leader to the nation's moral leader. Now, Washington wasn't naive. He was well aware that he had acquired instant fame. Washington's retirement, said Jonathan Trumbull, writing from London, excites the astonishment and admiration from this part of the world. King George III predicted, "If Washington does this, he will be the greatest man in the world." Whew. Washington's legacy to us, the American people, was a successful revolution. However, not all revolutions end this way. Have you ever heard of Napoleon? Have you ever heard of Lenin, Stalin, Castro? All claimed to be liberators, but millions upon millions died under their oppression. Because of Washington's leadership, the military would be subordinate to civilian authority. Ours was an exceptional revolution because of exceptional behavior or virtue. A modern Cincinnatus, he laid down his sword in Annapolis and picked up his plow at Mount Vernon. America stood at a crossroads. Newburgh was significant for what did not happen. Without fanfare, an incident that could have destroyed America quietly slipped into history. There would have been no constitutional convention, no presidency, no country without his leadership. Virtuous leaders are necessary for example and for inspiration. Washington earned his place in history by being that virtuous leader. He understood the power of leaders in setting the course of a nation. We are living on in the legacy of Washington's transformational leadership. And concerning this, I cannot tell a lie.